My girlfriend cheated on me with my father, and they took everything from me in court, but I found out that they are in a cult, so I... Hey everyone, before I jump into this, I just want to say, if you're here, please consider subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications. It really helps, and honestly, not enough people stick around till the end. Alright, let's get into it. Hi Reddit, my name is Jacob, but everyone calls me Jake. I live in a quiet suburb of Chicago with my wife, Lauren. We've been together for almost 10 years, married for 7. We were that couple everyone admired, the ones who made it through college together, survived the struggles of early adulthood, and came out stronger on the other side. Or at least, that's what I thought. Lately, things have felt off. At first, I brushed it off as stress. Lauren works in marketing, and her job can be demanding. But then the late nights started happening more frequently. She used to be home by 6, sometimes 7 if there was a big project. Now, she was coming home at 9 or even later, and when I asked about it, she always had an excuse: tight deadlines, last-minute meetings, a demanding client. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But then came the phone thing. Lauren had never been secretive about her phone before. We both had access to each other's devices, not because we didn't trust each other, but because it never mattered. But now, her phone was always either face down or in her pocket. If it rang and I was nearby, she'd snatch it up before I could even glance at the screen. I try not to let it get to me, but once you notice something like that, it's impossible to ignore. The changes didn't stop there. She became distant. The way she used to laugh at my dumb jokes? Gone. The way she used to lean into me on the couch, absent-mindedly running her fingers through my hair? Gone. At night, she'd turn away from me, claiming she was too tired or stressed for anything intimate. I started telling myself I was just being paranoid, that maybe she really was just exhausted from work. But then I found something that I couldn't ignore. That night, while Lauren was asleep, I installed a hidden camera in the living room. I told myself it was just to confirm my suspicions, but deep down, I already knew what I was going to find. I also reached out to an old friend from college who worked in IT. I told him I needed help accessing some deleted messages from a phone. He didn't ask too many questions, just told me he could do it if I got him access to the device. That part was going to be tricky, but I was willing to take the risk. A few days later, I got my chance. Lauren was in the shower, and her phone was charging on the nightstand. My hands were shaking as I grabbed it, knowing I only had minutes. I sent the data to my friend, put everything back exactly as it was, and walked out of the room as if nothing had happened. While I waited for him to recover the messages, I checked the hidden camera footage. At first, there was nothing unusual. Lauren coming home late, scrolling through her phone, barely looking at me when she walked past. Then, one evening when I was working late, the camera caught something. She was on the couch, laughing in a way I hadn't heard in months, her face glowing in a way that made my stomach drop. She was on a video call. I turned up the volume, and that's when I heard it, a man's voice. Deep, familiar. My whole body went cold. The camera wasn't good enough to pick up his face, but the way he spoke, the way she responded, it was intimate. I felt sick. The next morning, my IT friend sent me the recovered messages. I hesitated before opening them, but I had come this far. There was no going back. I scrolled through texts filled with things I never should have seen. Plans to meet up, talks about how much they missed each other, things that made my blood boil. But then, I saw the name. Tom Morgan. My father. My entire body went numb as I stared at the name on the screen. Tom Morgan. My father. My own blood. The man who raised me, who was supposed to be my role model. The one person I never thought would betray me like this. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the phone. For a moment, I couldn't even breathe. It felt like my mind was refusing to process what I had just seen, like if I looked away, it would somehow disappear. But it was real. It was right there in front of me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something, break everything in sight, confront them both and watch their faces crumble under the weight of their own betrayal. The rage boiling inside me was unlike anything I had ever felt before. But I forced myself to stay calm. Acting on emotions wouldn't do me any good. If I let myself explode now, I might say or do something that would only make things worse for me. Instead, I sat down and started thinking. I needed a plan. If Lauren had been unfaithful, then our marriage was over. That much was clear. But I wasn't going to let her walk away easily, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let my father get away with this either. I needed to be smart about this, to make sure that when the dust settled, I came out on top. The first thing I did was consult a lawyer. I didn't tell him everything yet. I wasn't ready to say the words out loud, but I told him enough. I asked what my options were, how I could minimize my losses in the divorce, and what steps I needed to take to protect myself. He advised me to gather as much evidence as possible and to start quietly preparing my exit. That meant making sure my finances were in order, documenting everything, and not letting Lauren suspect that I knew. It wasn't easy. Every time I looked at her, I felt sick. Every time she touched me, I had to fight the urge to recoil. Every word she said, every lie that came out of her mouth, made my blood boil. But I played my part. I pretended everything was fine, that I was just another clueless husband who trusted his wife. But in reality, I was waiting for the perfect moment to make them both pay. I thought I had prepared for everything. I had my lawyer, I had my evidence, and I was ready to walk away with my dignity intact, even if it meant cutting Lauren out of my life completely. But I had underestimated just how deep this betrayal ran. It started when Lauren filed the lawsuit. I expected it. I knew she wouldn't go quietly, but what I didn't expect was how quickly things turned against me. At first, my lawyer assured me that we had a solid case. Illinois was an equitable distribution state, which meant that marital assets should have been divided fairly. I had proof of her affair, which, while not always a deciding factor, could have given me leverage in negotiations. But then, things took a turn I never saw coming. One by one, everything started slipping away. The house, awarded to Lauren. The savings account, nearly drained after a sudden legal decision that granted her access to more than half of it. My car, technically a shared asset, and since she needed it more, she got to keep it. Even my retirement fund was suddenly on the table for division. It was as if the judge had already made up his mind before I even stepped into the courtroom. I was furious. None of it made sense. My lawyer was blindsided, scrambling to figure out how things had gone so wrong so fast. And then, the truth hit me like a freight train. Tom, my own father. He had spent his entire life building a network of powerful friends, and now he was using them against me. A quiet word here, a favor called in there, and suddenly, the entire system was stacked against me. He had falsified documents, twisted facts, and manipulated the right people to make sure Lauren walked away with everything while I was left with nothing. It was a complete betrayal, not just from my wife, but from the man who had raised me. My own father had taken her side, not only in secret, but in public, in court, and in front of the law. I wasn't just losing my marriage. I was losing everything I had ever worked for, and the man responsible for it all shared my last name. The fallout from my father's betrayal didn't just destroy my life. It tore my entire family apart. I hadn't planned on telling my mother. At first, I didn't even know how to begin. How do you explain to your own mother that her husband, the man she built a life with for over 30 years, had been sleeping with her son's wife behind his back? How do you tell her that the man she trusted had not only betrayed her, but had gone so far as to ruin his own son in court just to protect his mistress? But I didn't have to tell her. She found out on her own. My mother, Karen Morgan, was never the type to pry, but she was sharp. She could sense that something was wrong, and when she started asking questions, I couldn't keep up the act anymore. The moment I told her the truth, I saw the color drain from her face. At first, she just sat there in stunned silence, as if her mind was refusing to accept what she had just heard. Then, without a word, she stood up, grabbed her purse, and walked out the door. I didn't know where she went until later that night, when she called me from a hotel. She had confronted my father. She had looked him in the eyes and demanded the truth, and he hadn't even tried to deny it. According to her, he barely showed any remorse. He acted as if it was something she should have expected, as if he had every right to do what he did. That was when she realized there was nothing left to save. The next morning, she filed for divorce. My father tried to reach out to her, but she refused to answer his calls. She blocked his number, packed her things, and moved out of the house they had shared for decades. She wanted nothing to do with him. He had betrayed his son, humiliated his family, and destroyed the foundation of everything they had built together. She told me that even if she could somehow forgive the affair, she could never forgive what he had done to me. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I wasn't alone. My father had taken everything from me, but at least he hadn't taken my mother. And as much as I had lost, I knew he had lost something too: his wife, his family, and any respect he once had. And this time, there was no going back. Eric had always looked up to me. As my younger brother, he had grown up following my lead, trusting that I would always be the one to protect him, to set the example, to be the steady force in his life. But now, for the first time, he was the one stepping up for me. When he found out what had happened, he was furious. At first, I could see the disbelief in his eyes, the same look Mom had when she first heard the truth. But once it settled in, once the shock wore off, all that was left was anger. Not just at Lauren, not just at our father, but at the entire situation, at the way I had been completely torn apart while they walked away untouched. He refused to let it stand. "We're not letting them get away with this," he said, his voice filled with a determination I hadn't heard before. "I don't care what it takes. We're going to find a way to make them pay." For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than rage or despair. I felt something close to hope. Eric took it upon himself to dig deeper. He started making calls, reaching out to contacts he had through work, looking for someone who could help. It didn't take long before he found exactly what we needed: a private investigator, someone who specialized in uncovering financial fraud, corruption, and hidden secrets. If my father had used dirty tactics to rig the court case, we were going to find out. If Lauren had more skeletons in her closet, we were going to expose them. We also hired a new lawyer, someone completely disconnected from my father's influence. My previous attorney had been competent, but this time, I needed someone relentless, someone who wouldn't back down even when faced with the kind of power and connections my father had. The plan was simple. We would gather evidence, build a case, and take them down from every possible angle. My father thought he was untouchable, that his name and reputation could shield him from any consequences. But he had underestimated us. For the first time since this nightmare started, I didn't feel like I was fighting alone. My mother had walked away from him. My brother was standing beside me. And now, with the right people in place, I was ready to fight back. The investigation took weeks, but every piece of information we uncovered only made things worse. What had started as a personal betrayal between my father and my wife quickly spiraled into something far bigger, something far darker than I had ever imagined. At first, the private investigator focused on my divorce case, trying to find proof that my father had manipulated the outcome. It didn't take long before he found something suspicious. The judge assigned to my case had a history of ruling overwhelmingly in favor of certain high-profile clients, most of whom had one thing in common. They had all hired attorneys with close connections to my father. It was a pattern that couldn't be ignored. The deeper we dug, the more we found. My father wasn't just helping Lauren. He had been doing this for years, using his influence to rig court cases for wealthy clients. Divorce settlements, business disputes, property battles. If someone had enough money and was willing to pay the right price, my father made sure the courts ruled in their favor. He had built an entire system of corruption, using bribery, forged documents, and backdoor deals to make sure his clients always won. And Lauren? She wasn't just some affair. She was part of it. She had known exactly what she was doing when she took him as her lover. She wasn't just leaving me. She was securing her future, aligning herself with someone who could make sure she came out of our divorce untouched while I was left with nothing. The realization made me sick. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. My father and Lauren had been playing a game where people's lives were nothing more than pieces to be moved around for profit and power. I had been one of those pieces, but I wasn't going to let them win. Eric and I sat down with the private investigator and our new lawyer, laying out everything we had found. There was enough evidence to take them down, enough to expose not just their affair, but the entire corrupt empire my father had built. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had the upper hand. My father had spent years thinking he was untouchable, but he was about to learn just how wrong he was. When we finally had enough evidence to bring everything to light, Eric and I didn't waste a single moment. We took everything, every document, every bank transaction, every recorded conversation our private investigator had uncovered, and handed it over to the authorities. This wasn't just about my divorce anymore. This was about exposing a network of corruption that had been quietly operating for years, protected by my father's influence and power. The moment the case was opened, the cracks in my father's empire started to show. The judge who had ruled against me, the one who had taken bribes from my father and countless others, suddenly disappeared. He didn't show up for work. His house was emptied overnight, and there were whispers that he had fled the country to avoid prosecution. Without him to protect my father, the rest of his allies began to scatter. People who had once relied on my father started distancing themselves. Lawyers he had worked with for years refused to take his calls. Business partners who had once praised him now pretended they had never met him. No one wanted to go down with him. And then there was Lauren. At first, she acted like she was untouchable, like none of this would affect her. But the moment investigators started questioning her about her involvement, she panicked. She had always been calculating, always thinking 2 steps ahead, but she had never expected this. She had never planned for what would happen when the walls closed in. The financial fraud charges alone were enough to ruin them both. My father had laundered money through fake legal fees, moving cash in ways that even some of his closest allies hadn't been aware of. Lauren had benefited from it, whether she had directly participated or not, and now, she was just as much of a target as he was. The authorities moved quickly, freezing accounts, seizing documents, and preparing charges that would ensure neither of them walked away from this unscathed. My father, the man who had once controlled everything, who had rigged the system to work in his favor, was suddenly powerless. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I finally felt like justice was coming. The trial was long and brutal, but in the end, justice was served. The evidence against my father was overwhelming. His decades of corruption, bribery, and fraud were laid out for the world to see, and there was no escaping it this time. No connections, no last-minute deals, no favors to call in. He was completely exposed, and there was nothing he could do but watch as everything he had built came crashing down. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was silent. 5 years in federal prison. That was the sentence my father received, and while it wasn't nearly enough to make up for everything he had done, it was enough to make sure he would never be able to manipulate the system again. His reputation, his career, his influence, everything was gone. Lauren didn't get off easy either. Though she hadn't orchestrated the fraud herself, she had knowingly benefited from it, and that was enough to convict her. 3 years in prison. I watched as the reality of it hit her. As the woman who had once thought she was untouchable realized she had lost everything. No money, no power, no escape. The court also ruled to seize every asset they had obtained illegally. The money, the properties, the business holdings, it was all taken, stripped away in the same ruthless way they had stolen from others. As for me, I wasn't left empty-handed. With my father's influence gone, I was finally able to fight for what was rightfully mine. A new trial overturned the previous ruling on my divorce settlement, and I was able to recover a significant portion of my assets. I wasn't able to get everything back, but I got enough to rebuild my life. My mother, Karen, also got the justice she deserved. Her divorce was finalized, and she was awarded half of the joint property she had shared with my father. She walked away with financial security, but more importantly, she walked away with her dignity. She had spent years by my father's side, believing in him, trusting him, only to have him throw it all away. But she wasn't going to be another one of his victims. She was free. In the end, my father and Lauren had destroyed themselves. They had betrayed the people who loved them. And for what? Greed, power, control? None of it had been worth it. They lost everything, while the people they had tried to crush had risen from the ashes. I had spent so long feeling like I had lost, like they had won, like they had taken everything from me. But as I walked out of that courtroom for the last time, I realized the truth. They were the ones who had lost. Leaving Chicago was the easiest decision I ever made. The city had become a graveyard of memories, filled with ghosts of betrayal and anger, and I knew that if I stayed, I would never truly move on. I packed what little I had left, sold what I didn't need, and drove until the skyline disappeared in my rearview mirror. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Starting over wasn't easy, but I was done letting the past define me. I found a job in another state, something completely different from what I had done before, something that didn't tie me to the world my father had built. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and that was all that mattered. For the first time in my life, I was building something that was truly mine, without anyone's influence or manipulation. At first, I kept to myself, unsure if I could trust people again. The betrayal had left deep scars, ones that I wasn't sure would ever fully heal. But over time, I met people who showed me that not everyone was out to use or deceive me. I made friends, real friends, the kind who didn't care about my last name or my past. And then, without expecting it, I met someone. It wasn't some grand, dramatic moment, just a quiet, simple connection that grew over time. She didn't pry into my past, didn't push me to talk about things I wasn't ready for, and for the first time in a long time, I felt safe. It wasn't about replacing what I had lost, but about finding something new, something real. Most importantly, I learned to recognize the signs I had ignored before. I would never let myself be manipulated again. I would never ignore my instincts, never dismiss my own worth, and never allow anyone to make me feel like I was powerless. My father and Lauren had tried to destroy me, but in the end, they had only freed me. They had shown me exactly what kind of people I would never allow in my life again. And as I stood on the doorstep of my new home, looking at a future that was finally mine, I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. I was free. Life had finally started to feel normal again. I had built something for myself in a new city, far away from the wreckage of my past. I had a stable job, a quiet apartment, and people around me who didn't know or care about the name Morgan. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving. I was actually living. But then, the feeling started. At first, I chalked it up to paranoia. After everything I had been through, it wasn't surprising that my mind was still on high alert. The betrayal, the trial, the years of manipulation. I had learned the hard way not to trust easily. So when I first noticed someone watching me from across the street or a car parked a little too long outside my building, I convinced myself it was nothing. Just a coincidence. Just my past playing tricks on me. But then the notes started appearing. The first one was tucked under my windshield wiper when I came out of work late one evening. It was just a plain white piece of paper, no handwriting, no words, just a strange, almost ritualistic symbol drawn in thick black ink. Something about it sent a chill down my spine, but I told myself it was probably some prank, maybe even a weird marketing scheme. I crumpled it up and threw it away. But then it happened again. Another note, another symbol. This time, it was taped to my apartment door. I checked the security cameras in my building, but the footage showed nothing, just static for the exact time frame when the note must have been left. That was when I started to feel the fear creep in. This wasn't just my imagination. Someone was watching me, and they wanted me to know it. And then, Eric stopped answering his phone. At first, I figured he was just busy. He had been keeping himself occupied ever since the trial, trying to move on in his own way. But as the days passed without a single response, I knew something was wrong. Eric wasn't the type to go off the grid. If he was ignoring me, it wasn't by choice. I drove back to his apartment, knocking on the door until my fists hurt. No answer. The lights were off, and his car was gone. I called his work, but they said he hadn't shown up in days. His friends hadn't heard from him. It was as if he had vanished without a trace. And then, on the hood of my car, I found another note. This time, there was no symbol. Just 3 words, scrawled in red ink. You took everything. My blood ran cold. Whoever had left that message wasn't just watching me. They wanted me to know that whatever was happening to Eric, whatever was coming next, was because of me. When my phone finally rang, and Eric's name flashed across the screen, I felt a wave of relief so intense that I nearly dropped the phone in my rush to answer. Eric? Where the hell have you been? My voice came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. I had been on edge for days, waiting, wondering if something had happened to him. There was silence on the other end for a moment before he finally spoke. Jake, listen, I need you to stop looking for me. His tone was off. It wasn't just exhaustion or stress. It was something else, something colder, something that made my stomach tighten with unease. What? What are you talking about? I demanded. You disappeared. You weren't answering your phone. I've been trying to. I know. He cut me off, his voice lower now, almost resigned. I know you've been looking, and I'm telling you to stop. You don't understand what you're messing with. A chill ran down my spine. What I'm messing with? Eric, someone's been following me. Leaving messages. Leaving threats. Someone knows what we did, and now you're telling me to back off? You need to tell me what the hell is going on. There was another pause, longer this time, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I made a deal, Jake. I felt the blood drain from my face. A deal. I didn't have a choice, he said, and this time there was something almost desperate in his voice. They weren't going to let us walk away from this clean. You think Dad was the only one playing the game? He wasn't. There are people bigger than him, more powerful than him, and they want payback for what we did. The air around me suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. Who? I asked, my voice tight. Who did you make a deal with, Eric? I can't tell you that, he said quickly. I shouldn't even be calling you. But I'm telling you, stay out of this. Move on. Leave it alone. You can't win this fight. I clenched my jaw, my grip tightening on the phone. And what about you? There was another pause before he finally answered. I did what I had to do to survive, Jake. The meaning behind his words hit me like a sledgehammer. He had sold me out. He had found a way to save himself. And in doing so, he had put me in the crosshairs of whoever was pulling the strings behind all of this. My own brother, the one person I thought I could trust, had chosen his own skin over mine. Eric, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Tell me you didn't. Silence. Then the line went dead. The morning started like any other. I woke up, made coffee, and sat by the window, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my chest ever since Eric's call. I had barely slept since then, my mind replaying his words over and over, searching for some way to make sense of what he had done. But no matter how many times I went over it, the reality remained the same. My brother had betrayed me, and now I was completely on my own. My phone buzzed on the table. An unknown number. I hesitated for a moment before picking it up. The message was short. Did you think it was over? A chill ran down my spine. Every instinct in me screamed that something was wrong. I didn't know who had sent the message, but I knew what it meant. This wasn't over. Whatever Eric had gotten himself involved in, whatever deal he had made, it hadn't ended things. It had only made them worse. And then, hours later, I got the call that shattered everything. My mother was dead. The police found her body in her apartment. The official report said it was suicide. A bottle of pills on the bedside table, an empty glass of water, a neatly written note apologizing for everything. A clean, tragic ending. But I knew better. Karen Morgan was a fighter. She had walked away from my father without hesitation, cut him out of her life the moment she learned the truth. She had supported me through everything, stood by me when I had nothing left. She would never have given up, never have left me like this. The note was the first red flag. It didn't sound like her. The words were cold, detached, almost rehearsed. And then there was the timing. Just days after Eric warned me to stop digging, just hours after I received a message telling me this wasn't over. It was too perfect, too convenient. I knew what had really happened. Someone had killed my mother and made it look like a suicide. And if they thought that was enough to scare me into silence, they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. I wasn't walking away. I wasn't backing down. Whoever did this was going to pay. It didn't take long for everything to turn against me. The morning after my mother's death, I woke up to the sound of loud banging on my door. My heart pounded as I looked through the peephole. Police officers, at least 3 of them, standing outside. I barely had time to process what was happening before they started calling my name. Jacob Morgan, open the door. We have a warrant for your arrest. The words sent a cold, sharp wave of panic through me. I hadn't done anything, but I knew exactly what this was. Someone had set me up. I grabbed my phone and backed away, my mind racing. There was no time to argue, no time to explain. If they had a warrant, it meant they had evidence. Evidence that someone had planted to make me the prime suspect in my mother's murder. The back window of my apartment was my only way out. I forced it open, climbed onto the fire escape, and moved as quickly and quietly as I could. The moment my feet hit the alley below, I started running. The city blurred around me as I sprinted down side streets and alleys, my only goal to get as far away as possible. I needed time to figure out what was happening, to understand how they had turned this on me. But most of all, I needed to find Eric. I tried calling him as soon as I was safe. No answer. I tried again. Nothing. I switched numbers, used an encrypted app, even tried reaching out through an old friend we both trusted. But Eric was gone. No one had seen him. No one knew where he was. It was as if he had vanished off the face of the earth. And then it hit me. Eric had warned me to stop digging. He had told me I was in over my head. He had made a deal with someone more powerful than we had imagined. And now, with my mother dead and the police after me, he had disappeared. I wasn't just being framed. I was being hunted. The more I ran, the deeper the truth buried itself beneath layers of deception, power, and fear. Every attempt to clear my name only led me to more questions, more dead ends, and more threats in the shadows. But the moment I finally uncovered the truth, I wished I hadn't. It started with an old file. Desperate for answers, I broke into my father's abandoned office. After his conviction, the place had been raided, but I knew how he worked. He never kept everything in one place. Hidden behind a false panel in his desk, I found something he had tried to keep buried. A collection of documents, bank statements, handwritten notes, and a list of names that sent a chill through my bones. At the top of those documents was a name I had never heard before. The Night Covenant. It wasn't just a business network or a political group. It was something much older, much darker, something that operated in the shadows, pulling the strings behind powerful people, twisting the world to fit their agenda. Bribery, blackmail, manipulation, even murder, nothing was beyond their reach. My father had been more than just a corrupt lawyer. He had been one of them. And that was when I realized what had really happened to Eric. He hadn't just disappeared. He had been taken. The Night Covenant didn't just use people, they owned them. When my father saw that his empire was collapsing, he must have tried to buy his way back in. And the price they demanded was Eric. I stared at the documents, my pulse pounding in my ears. The sacrifices, the disappearances, the people who had crossed them and were never heard from again. Eric had become one of them. My father had given his own son away to the organization that had made him powerful. And now, they were coming for me too. I spent days chasing ghosts, convinced that Eric had been taken, that he was being held somewhere against his will. But the brutal truth was far worse than anything I had imagined. Eric wasn't missing. He hadn't been kidnapped. He had chosen this. I found him in an abandoned estate on the outskirts of the city, a place that, according to the documents I had stolen from my father's office, had once been used for private gatherings by members of the Night Covenant. It was nearly midnight when I got there, the house shrouded in darkness except for a single light glowing from the second floor. He was waiting for me. The moment I stepped into the room, I saw him, standing by a grand fireplace, dressed in black, his posture eerily calm, as if he had been expecting me all along. But it wasn't just him. The room wasn't empty. There were others. Figures stood in the shadows, silent, watching. Their faces were hidden, but I could feel their presence, their power pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. Eric turned to face me, and for a brief moment, I saw something familiar in his expression, something almost human. But then he spoke, and whatever brother I had once known was gone. "You shouldn't have come here, Jake," he said, his voice unnervingly steady. I took a step forward, my hands clenched into fists. "I've been looking for you," I thought. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay in control. "I thought they took you." Eric tilted his head slightly, almost as if he found that amusing. "They didn't take me," he said. "I chose this." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "You knew," I said slowly, my voice barely above a whisper. You knew everything. About Dad. About the Covenant. About what they've done. And you still. They showed me the truth, he interrupted. You don't understand, Jake. This isn't just some corrupt group of businessmen pulling strings. The Covenant controls everything. Governments, corporations, the legal system. They don't just manipulate power. They are power. I shook my head, refusing to believe what I was hearing. So what? You sold your soul to them, just like Dad did. Eric sighed, as if he pitied me. I survived, he said simply. And now, I'm offering you the same chance. For a moment, the room felt colder. What? I asked, though deep down, I already knew what he was going to say. You have two choices, Eric said. Join us, or disappear. The others in the room shifted slightly, as if waiting for my answer. I looked at my brother, at the person who had once fought beside me, who had once promised we would never let them win. And I realized I was looking at a stranger. Eric had made his choice, but I had made mine too. I would never join them. I would never be like him, like my father, like the men who stood in the shadows and pulled the strings of the world. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to hide. I was going to destroy them. The Night Covenant had been untouchable for years, operating above the law, above consequences. But no system, no matter how powerful, was truly unbreakable. There was always a weak point, a foundation that could be cracked, a leader that could be cut down. And at the center of it all was a man known only as the Prophet. I uncovered his identity through the same files my father had tried to hide, buried under layers of false names and secret accounts. He wasn't some nameless figure lurking in the dark. He was a judge, one of the most powerful in the country, a man whose rulings had shaped laws, decided fates, and buried evidence that could have brought the Covenant down years ago. He was the reason my father had walked away with a reduced sentence. He was the reason men like my father had thrived in corruption while people like me were left to rot. Killing him wouldn't be enough. That was too easy. If I wanted to destroy the Covenant, I had to tear it apart from the inside. I started by collecting every piece of evidence I could. The documents, the financial transactions, the testimonies from people who had been ruined by them. But information alone wouldn't be enough. The system was rigged, the media controlled, the law compromised. Even if I exposed them, they would bury it before the truth ever reached the surface. I needed to do something radical, something irreversible. I needed to make sure that when I struck, the entire world would see it. And I had just the plan to do it. I knew there was no turning back the moment I stepped through the gates of the mansion. The Night Covenant had called their members together for a secret gathering, a ritual initiation for those who had proven their loyalty. It was the perfect opportunity. Everyone important would be in one place, including the Prophet. I had spent weeks preparing for this, planning every detail, securing the materials I needed, ensuring that when the night ended, there would be nothing left of them. The mansion was massive, an old estate hidden deep in the countryside, far from prying eyes. I had arrived under the guise of a new recruit, my invitation arranged through forged documents and a well-placed bribe. No one questioned me as I walked inside, past marble columns and flickering candlelight, past men in black robes whispering words of devotion to a cause that had rotted the world from the inside out. And then I saw him. Eric stood near the front of the grand hall, his expression unreadable, his posture straight and unyielding. He wasn't just another member now. He was fully committed, a believer, a disciple of their so-called truth. He didn't see me at first. I blended in, my hood pulled low, my hands steady as I moved through the shadows, placing the charges exactly where I had planned. Every pillar, every structural weak point, every place that would ensure that when the fire started, there would be no escape. The ceremony began. The Prophet stepped forward, his voice deep and commanding, his presence enough to make the room fall silent. He spoke of power, of legacy, of the unshakable foundation of the Covenant. He spoke as if they were gods, as if they were invincible. They weren't. I waited until the moment they lit the ceremonial fire in the center of the room. That was my signal. I pressed the detonator. The first explosion tore through the foundation, shaking the entire building. Screams erupted as the chandeliers crashed down, as the marble floor split apart, as flames surged up the walls. Panic spread through the crowd, masked figures shoving past each other, their illusion of control shattered in an instant. I moved fast, navigating the collapsing wreckage, searching for Eric. I found him near the altar, his eyes wide with shock, his mind racing to comprehend what was happening. You have to come with me, I shouted over the chaos. But he didn't move. You did this, he said, his voice barely audible through the roaring flames. I grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the exit, forcing him to run even as he resisted. The fire spread faster than I had anticipated, swallowing the hallways, consuming everything in its path. The screams behind us faded as the walls crumbled, as the roof gave way, as the Night Covenant was buried under its own corruption. I barely made it out before the final explosion tore through the heart of the mansion, sending a wave of heat and debris into the sky. I pulled Eric to the ground, shielding him as the last remnants of the Covenant burned. When it was over, he turned to me, his face twisted with something between fury and disbelief. "You destroyed everything," he whispered. I met his gaze, unflinching. "No," I said. "I saved you." He didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at the ruins, at the fire that had swallowed his new life whole. I didn't know if he would ever forgive me, but I didn't need his forgiveness. I had done what needed to be done. As I stood outside the burning ruins of the mansion, watching the last remnants of the Night Covenant crumble into ash, I expected to feel relief. I expected a sense of finality, of victory, of closure. But as the fire smoldered and the bodies inside were reduced to nothing, a darker realization settled over me. The Night Covenant was gone. But the game was not over. Power does not just vanish. It shifts. It waits. It adapts. I had torn down an empire that had existed in the shadows for decades, but that did not mean their influence had disappeared. There were still people out there who had relied on them, who had profited from them, who had learned from them. People who would be looking for answers. People who would want revenge. And now, they were looking at me. I had taken out the prophet. I had burned the Covenant to the ground. But in doing so, I had done more than just destroy them. I had replaced them. Whether I wanted it or not, I had stepped into a void of power, one that could not remain empty for long. The phone in my pocket vibrated. I pulled it out, expecting Eric, expecting the police, expecting anyone but this. It was an unknown number. No message, no name, just a single, unreadable symbol on the screen. One that I had seen before in my father's files, in the old documents of the Covenant. Even in death, they still had reach. Even in destruction, the game still continued. I could run. I could try to disappear, start over for the second time. But I knew the truth now. There was no escape from this world. I had a choice. I could spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, hunted by the remnants of the old order, waiting for the day they finally found me. Or I could become something else. Something stronger. Something untouchable. I clenched my fist around the phone and made my decision. The Night Covenant was dead, but I was still here. And for the first time, I was the one holding the strings. So that's it. That's how it all went down. I started as a man who just wanted the truth, and I ended up burning an entire empire to the ground. But the question is, did I really win? The Night Covenant is gone, but in its place, something new has risen. And now, I have to ask myself, am I any different from the ones I destroyed? What do you think? Was there ever another way? Should I have walked away when I had the chance, or was I always meant to end up here? Let me know your thoughts, because after everything that happened, I am not sure where the line between justice and power really is anymore. Would you have done the same in my place? Or did I go too far?